So to start off the lecture, I'd like to introduce to you the dad joke of today's lecture. How does a penguin build its house? It glues it together. Brumch. So in today's lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit more about what psychology is, more about kind of its origins, so its history. So we'll be talking a lot about lots of old white men. It's part of the reason why you're encouraged to also do your major written project, which is the biography, because so much of what we're going to talk about, the people who've contributed to psychology, represent a very whitewashed history. Let's get started. So psychology, unlike most other sciences, began as a deliberate attempt to start a new field, a new science. In the late 1800s, scholars at the time noted that there had been a lot of advances and knowledge gained in chemistry, biology, and other scientific fields, but we knew very little about the mind and how it worked. And so they had perfected the methods of science with these other fields, and so they utilized those methods of science to understand mental processes. Wilhelm Wundt, who was a German psychologist, was credited with having the first psychology lab that was kind of dedicated to understanding the mind. He argued that just like there were elements in chemistry, right? You guys probably have seen the periodic table. Those are the elements of anything that exists on Earth. He maintained that similarly, there were elements of experience, and those elements were represented as sensations and feelings that people had when they encountered a stimulus or situation. Experience, he also noted, is partially under your voluntary control. What that means is how you experience the world is partly dependent on what you're paying attention to. So if you're paying attention to something in a particular event and somebody else is paying attention to something different in that same event, your two experiences are going to be very different. And so because experience is partially under our voluntary control, we can then tailor or modify what our experiences can be. That's what he noted. And so in order to test his ideas about experience, because they viewed that experience was one way to kind of get into the minds of human beings, he asked subjects to do something completely novel and unheard of for the time, which was to introspect. Introspect means to look within. Essentially, what he did was he asked them what they were thinking, feeling, and experiencing to better understand how the mind was processing what was happening in the world. But just bear in mind, right now in psychology, we ask people to reflect and kind of introspect all the time. But at that time, in the late 1800s, it was the very first time someone had even thought to do that, to study the human mind. So it was completely innovative for the time. One of Wilhelm Wundt's students was Edward Titchener. Edward Titchener was curious about understanding the nature of experiences. And he argued that when we're presented with a stimulus, like an object, so to say, we have feelings, thoughts that are related to the sensations surrounding that object. And he believed that these pieces of our experiences, right, what we see, touch, taste, smell, those are the structures or the parts that compose the mind. And so asking people to kind of dissect their experiences around a particular object that he might present them, he called it structuralism. So again, to kind of more solidify the definition, structuralism is an attempt to describe the structures that compose the mind by asking people, when you hand them an object, to describe the parts that make up their experience. He was attempting to get them to describe the structures that make up their experience or their mind. So for example, he might present somebody with a lemon, and rather than just describing the lemon as a whole, he might ask them to first describe the shape, then describe the hue of the color that they're experiencing, and then lastly describe the texture of that lemon. So all three together kind of converge into the experience that a person has surrounding this lemon, but they are in fact separate pieces that the mind puts together to form a whole experience. At least that's what Edward Titchener argued for. William James is another old white man. This is our third old white man. There are many more coming up. He is recognized as the founder of American psychology. Interestingly enough, he never had his own lab, so he never actually did any research, but he spent a lot of time thinking about questions and human behavior. So he was interested in what he called functionalism, so he didn't really care about dissecting what's happening in the mind. He was more curious to identify how people produced useful behaviors. And so he wrote a book called The Principles of Psychology back in 1890 that identified some questions that we still study today in psychology. So for example, he asked questions like, how can people strengthen their habits? Or how does an intention lead to action? Or can someone pay attention to more than one thing at a time? So you'll see that these questions kind of still exist in psychological research today. Probably not as basic as they were back then, but they are still present in research today. So many of the early psychologists really wanted to discover a fantastic theory or kind of the laws of behavior and change our understanding of the human mind, but they quickly realized that it was really, really hard to do so. So what they did instead was they stuck with studying sensation. So we'll talk more about sensation and perception in another lecture later on in the semester, but sensation is kind of what a stimulus, so a particular energy that hits a sense organ and then gets converted into a language that our brain can understand. So sensation is the detection of some sort of energy. So if we're looking at light, for example, light travels in wavelengths, and so that energy is detected by cells within our eye, and that's sensation of light. And so the early psychologists, as I was mentioning, even though they wanted to kind of discover a theory or a grandiose law that pertained to human behavior, they paid very little attention to abnormal psychology, despite the fact that that is kind of what defines psychology as a field now. Most of their research, once they agreed that it was going to be impossible to kind of study the mind and its intricacies, they devoted much of their research to the study of vision and other sensations. It's really easy to study vision because you can present something with an object or a light or, changing the color of the light, and that can impact their experience of it, and they can describe what they've experienced. But what's really interesting is that the early psychologists quickly discovered that the physical stimulus that they presented their subjects with did not match the perception of the subjects. In fact, it wasn't accurate at all. So let me describe to you what I mean here. So on the y-axis, we have the perceived light. So this is what people are experiencing with regard to brightness of the light that they are being presented with. And over here, on the x-axis, is the actual measured light, like the physical property of light. you'll notice that when they kind of brought the light level to 50%, people didn't experience it at 50% brightness. They experienced it at a much brighter level, at 80%. So this is really important to note about our sensory systems, is that they are not absolute in measuring actual physical properties of things like light or sound wave. They measure it in terms of relative properties. It depends on what the person was doing before they experienced the stimulus. That influences how they experience the stimulus itself. But studying the mathematical relationship between the physical stimulus and the perception of that stimulus is known as psychophysical function. Psychologists actually tried to develop a mathematical equation to represent this relationship, and it was not linear. It wasn't a straight line as they thought it would be. So many of you have probably heard of Charles Darwin. He was kind of an evolutionary biologist. He was interested in understanding where the human species or other species came from. And he wrote this kind of incredibly innovative and kind of changing of our thinking book called Theory of Evolution by Natural Selection. It revolutionized the kind of field of biology, but it didn't simply affect biology, it also impacted psychology. So one of the things to keep in mind is that human beings, like all the species on this planet, are related to everything else. And so at the time, psychologists noted, based on Darwin's theory, that humans share remote common ancestors with all the other species that are present on this planet. And so a new field of psychology kind of developed and still exists to this day, comparative psychology. So comparative psychology represents a person, a scientist, who studies behaviors across different animal species to try to understand how that particular behavior evolved or what makes that behavior adaptive. But initially, the psychologists kind of took Darwin's theory and tried to apply it to this idea of intelligence. So what they wanted to do was measure kind of how smart we as human beings were. Like they were essentially waiting for us to be, on the very highest of the rankings of intelligence. But the problem that they quickly encountered when they were attempting to rank order animals on the planet from smartest to the least smart was that there was no way to test animals for intelligence, because animals have been adapted or have adapted to their particular environment and vary and differ from each other. Their kind of intelligence varies based on the environment in which they're living, right? And so it's nearly impossible to devise an intelligence test that you can administer both to a frog and a bird and a human being, right? So it's just impossible to do this. And so they quickly gave up on this idea. But now we still see remnants of this particular way of thinking in comparative psychologists. So while some psychologists were interested in kind of rank ordering human or animal intelligence, others were more interested in examining kind of what is giving rise to human intelligence. Francis Galton, another old white man, was the first one who tried to determine whether intelligence was something that could be inherited from our parents. So here's how he conducted this kind of observational experiment. He noticed that when he looked at very accomplished, successful adults in society, that their kids often were also accomplished or became accomplished adults in their own right. And because of this observation, this link that accomplished adults give rise to accomplished children, he argued that intelligence was hereditary. I hope you're able to see a flaw in this particular study of his. If not, pause and think about it. But what it comes down to is the fact that he ignored the fact that accomplished adults typically have access to money and resources that they can then give their children, who can utilize those resources to also become successful themselves. So he wasn't really measuring genetics, rather he was measuring environment as contributors to accomplishment. The other thing to keep in mind is that being accomplished or successful in society is not a good measure of intelligence, period. So he wasn't even really measuring intelligence when he chose to study what he did. But it wasn't until 1905 that Alfred Binet, yes, another old white man, developed the first useful intelligence test where people could actually be administered a test and they could be kind of scored on their intelligence. There are many different intelligence tests out there right now, some for children, some for adults, but there's a lot of arguments out there that these intelligence tests are devised for a particular culture, right? They're developed largely in the Western culture, and so they're not always an accurate measurement of all people's intelligence. Around the mid-1900s, so 1950s, psychologists became less interested in studying the mind and were really into studying behavior, because you really can't observe the mind, but it's really easy to observe behavior. And so they modified psychology as, rather than the systematic study of behavior and experience, they focused solely on behavior. They did not care about experience at all. John B. Watson, who will show up later on in the semester, is credited with being the founder of behaviorism. And we'll talk about behaviorism again in the semester. Behaviorism, which still exists today, is a field of psychology that is solely focused on what is observable. So measurable behaviors, they don't give a hoot about mental processes or what's happening in the mind. So inspired by John B. Watson's kind of interest in behavior, many psychologists began studying animal behavior, but particularly animal learning. So this is where you have scientists putting, rats in mazes to see if they can find foods, and then switch the place to see if they are able to remember where the original location was. So they were curious about animal learning. And scientists who study behaviorism also study human beings, but many, many scientists, many psychologists focus on animal learning. There are advantages to studying non-human animals. So one of the things that humans bring to any scientific study is what I call baggage, right? They have kind of their history, their past experiences, and as a result, you don't really know if you're getting a clean slate when you're trying to study something like learning or memory. But when you're studying non-human animals, we can control the entire life of an animal to ensure that there's nothing odd or different about their life experience from one rat to the next, from one pigeon to the next. And so whatever we learn about animals and learning, we can easily know that it was the modifications in our experiment that may have contributed to any differences we see in our results. The other thing about human learning is that it might be much more complex to study. And so using non-human animals and studying their learning might be a lot easier to understand, because we're assuming they're less complex. Well, I mean, they have a less complex brain, so it stands to reason why we might think that their learning might be simpler and easier to understand. All right, so you've probably heard of Freud if you've heard about psychology as a field, and if you haven't, that's totally fine. You're really not missing out on anything. Sigmund Freud was a psychiatrist, actually, so he was a medical doctor, and he was the first one to develop this idea of talk therapy, where he met with clients and had them talk through things to help them with their psychological disorders. The problem with Freud's studies, or Freud's teachings, is that a lot of his theories were based on absolutely no evidence at all. It's just he made so much stuff up and had very little basis for his theories. But there's nobody else. And so if you wanted to engage in the kind of talk therapy that Freud developed, most psychiatrists at the time were following, because they had no other choice, following Sigmund Freud's methods. But if you speak to most psychologists today, they will roll their eyes when you say the name Sigmund Freud, because it holds no value at all, other than kind of contributing to this idea of talk therapy. His theories have very, very little support in research, and they're just nearly impossible to study. Also, Freud was a massive cocaine addict, in case you didn't know, so stands to reason that he might just have had some issues going on given the theories that he developed. But here's what happened, right? Around the mid-1900s, most psychiatrists were following Sigmund Freud, but then World War II happened, like close to the mid-1950s, or rather the 1950s, and what ended up happening is that many of these soldiers from World War II, like which affected the entire world, but particularly in the United States, came back from the war dealing with these traumatic events. At the time, they called it shell shock. We now know that these soldiers had PTSD. Regardless, they came back from these traumatic experiences completely changed and needing help. Unfortunately, there were limited psychiatrists at the time, and so they could not keep up with the need. So was born the field of clinical psychology. Psychologists began providing therapy, and that's how this field of clinical psychology, that exists still today, developed. It was meeting a need of our society at the time. Most psychologists today are not attempting to find a grand theory or, kind of laws of behavior. Most psychologists today are trying to answer more kind of helpful or interesting questions. The research that's done falls into one of two categories. It can either be basic research or applied research. Basic research represents questions that are just trying to gain more knowledge, right? They're asking an interesting question and they find an interesting answer. They're not trying to apply that answer to change the world in any way. They're just trying to gain knowledge for its own sake. Applied research, on the other hand, is trying to identify a solution to practical problems. So most of the time, applied research asks questions whose answers can immediately be applied to the real world. So for example, if a researcher wants to study what type of classroom environment is best suited for student learning, that would be a question that would fall into the applied research category. But if we want to, know what types of smells does a dog prefer most, that would fall under the basic research category. Again, so there's no application, but maybe someday there will be if that situation arises. Since the 1960s, in addition to clinical psychology, there have been other fields of psychology that have been developed, the first of which was cognitive psychology, which is the study of thought and knowledge. That's gained gradual prominence in the field of psychology. In addition to cognitive psychology, neuroscience, which also kind of developed around the 70s and 80s, gained prominence, as did evolutionary psychology. But positive psychology, for example, was not a field of psychology that was around when I went to college. So it is relatively new, as are the fields of health and sports psychology. Neither of those two fields existed. So to give you an idea of what these fields represent, neuroscience is the study of the brain and how it affects the behavior. Evolutionary psychology is the study of how behaviors in the human beings are adaptive in some way. Positive psychology tries to study how people find joy, what sorts of things bring happiness to their lives, and what makes them happy and sustains happiness. Health psychology studies how people's behaviors ends up affecting their health. So a lot of the time, health psychologists study stress and how it might impact health. Sports psychology studies things like how do athletes perform under pressure, and how can they reduce performance anxiety. So those are some questions, general questions, that these areas of psychology study to give you a sense for what they represent. But psychologists today, unlike before where we have lots of, old white men, psychologists today have really broadened their scope to include more human diversity so that we can more accurately represent the human condition that is the field of psychology. So if we don't include everybody in who we choose to study, we won't really fully understand human beings and how their minds work. So here's your summary for this lecture. Psychology evolved for the purposes of studying the mind by using scientific processes that had been developed in other scientific fields. We talked about kind of the initial psychologists, but William James is really credited as the founder of American psychology and argued for functionalism. But we also talked about structuralism, as well as introspection. Studying sensation dominated the field of psychology initially because it was super easy to study, because you present somebody with a stimulus and ask them to describe it. It was much easier. That is until Darwin's theory of evolution, which kind of gave birth to comparative psychology. Behaviorism then next led the field, with psychologists choosing to study animal learning. Now psychology as a field is kind of incredibly broad and includes areas from clinical psychology to neuroscience to sports psychology. So it is much, much more kind of vast and broad, because we ultimately want to represent the human experience. And so we've broadened our kind of application of psychology to many, many fields. All right, here is your exit ticket for this lecture. If you have any questions, you're welcome to include them in your submission. If you have any trouble with any of these questions, don't hesitate to ask for help. I will be giving you feedback on it, but otherwise, you're done.